We've got offices in Melbourne, Canberra and Brisbane, and yeah, we've worked with a number of different government and non-government organisations. Today I'm going to talk about how you prioritise web accessibility in a actual website build. So I'm not going to talk about how you deal with current websites, making them accessible, but if you're building a new website, what is it that you need to look at? So first, I want to show you, this is my team, or it was my team a couple of years ago. We changed a little since then. Now, one of our mission statements is that we mimic the percentage of people with disabilities in the general population in our own organisation. So 19% of the population has some kind of disability that affects their daily life, and that doesn't include, say, the need to wear glasses or colour blindness or anything like that. And at the moment we have 35%, at this point we had 35% of our staff had a disability, but you wouldn't know that to look at any of us. Basically it's hidden in plain sight. Now Marissa, who's here, she's just got her eyes closed. She doesn't actually look like that usually. So, so you can't actually tell by looking at us that any of us have a disability. And that's a really important thing to remember, that people will have disabilities and they won't be walking around with a cane, or they won't be necessarily with a guide dog or in a wheelchair. So one of my staff uses a speech-to-text program to access a computer. Another needs a magnifier to use a computer. Now, the guy that uses a magnifier to use a computer can't use captures, but we use Gmail for our mailing system, and in order to set up a Gmail account, you need to fill out a capture. So he can't do that, so I have to do that. So it does actually affect, our business. I get migraines, not defined as a disability, but definitely affected by an inaccessible website. I've had migraines triggered 4 times by testing videos that had flickering content. We've got a woman who's got epilepsy. She doesn't test videos because something that would trigger a migraine in me will trigger an epileptic fit for her, which is incredibly dangerous. And we've got 2 different people with 2 very different types of dyslexia. One, he has difficulty reading content. The other has no difficulty reading content at all, but has difficulty writing content. So it's not just you transpose the letters. Dyslexia is much more complicated than that. So I suppose what I just want to make clear is it's not just about vision impairments. When we talk about people with disabilities in Australia, there are about 300,000 people with moderate to severe vision impairments, and that includes people with guide dogs, with canes, or my staff member who needs to use a magnifier to use a computer. There's 2 million Australians with reading disabilities, and that includes dyslexia, aphasia, a whole bunch of other things. And that doesn't mean they've got an intellectual disability. Their IQ will just be the same as any other person. It just means they have difficulty reading. So it's not just vision. So let's talk about prioritising web accessibility during a site build. And my computer stopped working. Okay, so these are the tasks that the times when you need to think about accessibility, and I'll go into these in more detail. So you need to think about it during the RFQ, when you're choosing your developers, your content authors, your staff, reviewing functional specifications, evaluating designs. Sometimes you might even want to consider evaluating wireframes. Reviewing the web style guide, because you want to make sure, of course, this stuff is maintained accessibly. Evaluating templates, running training for things like developers and content authors, and be aware that if you're a client, you might actually end up paying to get an external developer trained. So that's the best way to basically make sure your site is accessible. There's other training that might be relevant to you in terms of things like creating accessible Word documents or PDF tagging and things like that. And then a final site audit. So, conditions in the RFQ. Ensure accessibility requirements are covered in the RFQ, including things like that the site will be tested during key times. Now, the important thing to note also is that you need to include this in the project plan as well and in the timeline. So a lot of times we get engaged, and there's time for us to actually review the design and review the template, but there's no time allowed for the developers or the designers to actually fix what we've identified. And so what ends up happening is nothing gets fixed. The incorrect things get rolled out and deployed, deployed, and we find exactly the same errors in the final site audit. And then the client goes, oh, we spent all this money because, you know, we wanted to make it accessible, but they didn't allow the time. It's preferable, it depends if you have accessibility people on staff. Some big organisations do, but not very many do. So it's preferable to engage an independent consultant. It also sometimes makes it a lot easier when talking to developers and talking to designers that it's an independent person. Often I got much more accomplished at Monash when I was an independent consultant for 6 months prior to being engaged as the manager of usability and accessibility services for 5 years. It's because as an independent consultant, my word carried weight. As a staff member, it was like, yeah. Now, the other thing is, how many developers, you know, who work for, you know, companies like Previous, Next and Reading Room are in the room here? Okay. And how many people are like government staff who are managing the build of a website? Okay, excellent, good then, because my talk is kind of aimed at you guys, but, you know, web developers, this is what your clients might be asking you. What I say to our clients, and in 90% of cases, we get engaged by the government organisation. What we say to those government organisations is if we find accessibility errors, then any changes need to be borne by those external developers, that you don't get charged extra if we find accessibility issues. And quite frankly, accessibility has been around for a very, very long time. I know everyone thinks that it only started with the National Transition Strategy. There have actually been accessibility requirements in Australia since 2000. So, you know, developers really should know, you know, what they're talking about now. A lot of them will say that you perhaps don't need to engage someone like us, but having just worked on the redevelopment of a website, we got engaged by Energy Rating to test their site for an accessibility compliance, and then they wanted us to fix the top 10 pages. And we said, well, basically you're going to have errors in your template, so we might as well give you a new template. And we might as well roll it across the site, not just 10 pages. And looking at the design, it's completely inaccessible. So we really need to give you a new design. And then they wanted a content audit, and they wanted Google Stats analysis and an information architecture and user testing. And so we did the whole thing. And it was the first time that we'd done such a massive project. And even though we're accessibility specialists, we found when we were building a new site that accessibility very easily fell off the side of the table. It's because there are so many things to think about. So, you know, yes, a developer might know everything they need to know about accessibility, but it is valuable to have someone whose sole purpose is to think about accessibility and to say, no, hold on. I know you've got no time and you're about to deploy 1,000 tables, but you need to make sure they're actually coded accessibly. The best thing you can do is ask for examples of accessible websites that they've worked on in the past. Now, we've worked with a number of organisations while they've gone through the RFQ process, and we've done a whole bunch of things like we've reviewed CMSs for accessibility compliance. We've looked at previous websites, and so there might be a short list of 3 companies, and they give that short list to us, and we actually end up making the final decision based on their previous work. So that's another way to make sure people know what they're talking about. Ask these external developers how they intend to make the website accessible. So have the developers undertaken any accessibility training? Be careful if they say they're accessibility certified, because there's no such thing. There are 2 major training things in Australia. There's the Diploma of Accessibility in the University of South Australia, which is part-time. It goes for 6 weeks. And basically it gives you a really good overview of accessibility. It doesn't train you how to make things accessible. Accessibility Oz is the only organisation that is endorsed by the Australian Web Industry Association to provide accessibility training. But there are other organisations that do training, so ask if they've actually undertaken any of that. Will they actually be engaging with independent experts? So we've seen companies get across the line because they've worked with us before, or they've even said we'll bear some of the Accessibility Oz cost, or they go in for a tender partnering with us. What accessibility testing tools will they be using to ensure accessibility compliance? I don't know, it might be a bit of an in-joke, but if anyone says Bobby, which was around in 1999, then you know they know what they're talking about. So we did have one client say, oh no, we're happy with our current web developer. We've got this little badge on our website that says we're accessible, and it was a Bobby badge, and they got sold to App Verify in like 2002, so they don't really exist anymore. Will they be testing with people with disabilities? Now, that's not necessarily something that you have to do, but if you're talking about something that's incredibly complex, like learning modules or a web application, WCAG 2 probably isn't going to pick up everything, and you need to start thinking about user testing with people with disabilities. The content management system. Does it output valid code, as in code that actually complies with the W3C HTML validator? Does it force authors to add alt attributes to images? But does it also allow authors to add empty alt attributes, which is basically where there's no information there? Does it force authors to specify page titles? Does it automatically append the site title to the page title? Because one of the requirements in WCAG 2 is that every single page title needs to be unique, but it also needs to reference the name of the site, and it needs to reference the name of the site consistently. Now, if you push that out to the content authors, they're going to be talking about, say, University of Macquarie, or they might say MQ, or they might say Uni of Macquarie. If you do that automatically with the CMS, it's going to make it easier. Does it allow authors to use heading styles? Is it easy to choose heading styles as opposed to making something bold and 14 point? Does it allow authors to specify table headers? Now, one thing we've found is there are some CMSs out there that automatically code table headers for data tables. We just spent a huge amount of work with Grains Research and Development Corporation manually coding their data tables because Sitecore doesn't actually code data tables correctly. Does it allow authors to code quotations? So quotations are actually, they're kind of referred to in a technique in WCAG 2 under level A. Basically, you do need to actually use the Q tag and the block quote tag when you have quotations. But the problem with just a content author adding those tags is, firstly, they're usually not in the CMS, so they have to use HTML, which is, going to be difficult. But the other problem is that, one browser, if you use the Q tag, will add a quotation mark, another browser won't. So you actually have to do all these fancy CSS things to say, if it's IE, do this, if it's Firefox, do that, if it's Chrome, do this. So the CMS actually should start managing that. Come on, computer. When assessing RFQ responses, consider an interview process, and this doesn't have to be a face-to-face interview, but like just sending it out some questions, saying, tell me what are the actual accessibility requirements for forms. And so they should answer things like visible field labels, coded with label 4 on ID, HTML submit buttons, field sets with legends, for radio buttons and checkboxes. Now, you don't need to know what those are, but if they kind of hit those words, then they know what they're talking about. What are the main accessibility requirements for data tables? So TH or TH scope or THID, TD or TD headers, and summary and caption are required by WCAG 2 as well. The other thing that you could do is actually give them something and say, provide me the code for that, or show me what the CMS will output if you were going to code that for us. And then, we've got these things called 10 help desk hours. So basically you could send them to us and we could spend half an hour looking at them and we could say, yes, it's perfect, or no, there are problems, and then you can take it up with the developers. Functional specifications. So engage an independent expert to review functional specifications for things like whether JavaScript solutions have HTML fallbacks, because that is still a requirement. If you've got web apps or learning modules or things like that, you can get away with just having JavaScript, but you have to engage an accessibility specialist according to the Australian Human Rights Commission web advisory notes. But the important thing is, if you can do something in HTML, then you do it in HTML, and if you want to provide additional features, then JavaScript is okay. But the other thing that is even more important is make sure the actual JavaScript itself is accessible. I'll talk about our fact sheets a little bit later on, but we have JavaScript and accessibility fact sheets, which talk about how you go about making JavaScript accessible. And the best thing to do to test something that's JavaScript is see if you can operate everything using the keyboard. So that's basically where a lot of JavaScript falls over. Any images that should be included in the CSS, be aware that if they're in the CSS, they're not going to be read out to a screen reader, so they have to be basically ornamental images, or they need to be given empty alt attributes. Hidden structural labels. Russ Weekly did a great article on this a few years back about hidden structural labels, because he found that screen reader users didn't really understand the whole nested hierarchy of lists for menus and navigation. So we recommend that, and it's pretty easy to do. And also things like "you are here" prior to breadcrumbs, and labels for, you know, search results and things like that, like "go to page" and things like that. And it can be hidden. It doesn't need to be visible. Other things, so at the functional spec stage, you need to think about video requirements. So if you're going to have videos, you need to provide transcripts, captions and audio descriptions. I just wrote an article for SitePoint, it was published last week, on creating online accessible videos, so have a look at that. You also need to think about our video player. Well, I say ours. We actually built one because we couldn't find a fully accessible video player. And so a whole bunch of reasons as to why all the various different video players don't work. But if you're using just the YouTube video player, it's a keyboard trap in Firefox, which is an incredibly serious accessibility issue. So AusPlayer, feel free to look it up, can play YouTube videos and things like that, or CDN videos. So have a think about that. Think about PDFs and Excel documents and PowerPoint and Word, and it's not okay to have a PDF version and a Word version if you're not 100% sure that that Word version is accessible. You can't save Word versions as read-only documents, because if you save them as read-only, then no assistive technology is going to access them. So you need to have some kind of idea of what you're going to do with these documents. And we don't say, you know, you've got a 5,000 PDFs. Department of Primary Industries down in Victoria, against my advice, decided that, you know, they had a website, 8,000 pages, 5,000 pages, 8,000 PDFs. They converted them all to HTML, 9,000 page website, cost them $1 million. Now, quite frankly, if you've got $1 million to spend on accessibility, and quite frankly, who does, then that's probably not the best way of spending it. You've got a huge number of PDFs, you need to prioritise them. You need to think about what people access, when they access them. You know, are they aimed at people with disabilities, etc., because none of us have the money or the time to actually convert them all. And then additional accessibility features such as increased, decreased text size, colour contrast picker, print buttons, or maybe even implementing a technology like Browse Aloud, which is a free assistive technology for the website users, but the website owner has to pay for it. So then we get to design. So you test designs for things like reliance on JavaScript for form submissions. So when you see a design and there's no submit button or go button, then you know that they're relying on JavaScript, and at this point you can say, no, hold on, you need to put in the design some kind of submit button. Source order changes. So there's a rule that if you make a change, the change can't occur prior to the current focus unless you warn the user. So I've got an example of that later. Visible field labels for fields. There are sometimes when you don't have to have field labels, but they're very few and far between. So basically you really always need to have visible field labels, and appropriate colour contrast. We pick up a lot of colour contrast issues in design. So on the left is an example of a source order failure. So basically you make a change down the bottom and then the links above change. So that would be something you could pick up at design. On the right here is a form that uses JavaScript for submission. I know that because there is no submit button. So what you basically do is you type in the suburb, and as soon as you typed in a valid suburb, the whole content changes. The powered by Google we'd pick up as an error at this point because it doesn't have a visible field label. So what, exactly are you searching for? Probably using Google, searching the site. But the other thing is the powered by Google doesn't meet colour contrast requirements. So there's going to be a group of users that won't be able to see that at all. Colour contrast. There's a great product by the Pacello group called the Colour Contrast Analyzer, where you just basically use a picker to choose different colours. But there's also a website by Juicy Studio, which is a luminosity colour contrast analyzer, where you put in the hexadecimal values. So, you know, send them to your design team and say it's your responsibility to make sure colour contrast, you know, is met. Web Style Guide. Review Web Style Guide for issues such as heading usage, alt attributes for images, table headers for tables, use of italics, summary text, etc. Template, so things that you look for are things like coded field labels, table headers, coded headings, hidden structural labels, which I'll talk about in a minute. Correct layout when style sheets are disabled. So one of the best ways to see how a screen reader is going to read your site is turn the style sheets off and see what happens. We see in a lot of sites, especially ones that use slideshows or JavaScript for navigation, that the content, when you turn style sheets off, moves. And what happens is the screen reader will read some of that content, and then the content will move and it will jump to something else. And then they can't actually use the site because they can't ever move around. Form functionality without JavaScript, and have a think about HTML5 and ARIA. So this is, for example, this is a Telstra site. I love picking on Telstra because they've got an accessibility team, but it's such a massive site that they keep making mistakes. But basically, you turn style sheets off and all you see is this stuff about feedback. And it actually has no reference to what the site actually has. And what is actually happening is that if you hover on the right-hand side, because you would, a little thing pops out that says, do you want to give us feedback? And then it shows you this. But they've done it in a certain way that that's the only thing you see if you turn style sheets off. So this is an example of hidden structural labels. Now, you don't have to do it this way. So we've had different organisations do it different ways. But basically, this here, secondary navigation, level 2 secondary navigation, they're all hidden structural labels. You don't see them when style sheets are on, but they're read aloud to the screen reader user, so the screen reader user knows what's going on. Now, it's important to say that this is navigation and that you're starting another level. It's also important to say that you're ending the level, because screen readers don't necessarily indicate very well they're moving from this item to this item. You can see that it's a different hierarchy, but screen reader users can't tell that information. Developer training. Think about conducting developer training for external and in-house developers. So things like page source order and structure, page titles, headings, link text, text alternatives for pages, PDFs, images, video, forms, field labels, field sets, legends, meaningful sequence, error identification. Once you get to AA, you need to have error suggestions as well. So if you have a form and it's submitted incorrectly, not only do you need to identify the error, you also need to give a suggestion for a solution to that error. So you actually, at level A, if you say fill out the name, you leave the name field incorrect, empty. It will, level A says you need to fill out the name field. AA says you need to fill out the name field, for example, John Smith. Now, it might seem like overkill, but that's one of the requirements. Tables, table headers, summary, caption, content author stuff. So there's a little bit of overlap. So headings, page titles, link text, etc. In our training, we spend a lot more time on alt attributes. So alt attributes for images, there are different requirements when talking about image galleries, for example. We talk about that in the content author training. Video requirements, so in the developer training, we talk about the video player. In the content author training, we talk about transcripts, captions and audio descriptions. Content requirements such as coding quotations, changes in language, colour and location. Now, there are a number of generic writing content accessibly training. And so, you certainly could send people to that, but it is actually valuable to get someone in to run this training because they can run it specific to your CMS. So there's no point going through with content authors how to code a data table if they're going to actually use a button in their CMS to do that. I went backwards. And there's a whole bunch of other training you can think about as well. Creating accessible Word documents, PDF tagging, HTML5, ARIA, JavaScript, more PDF tagging, video transcripts, audio descriptions and captions. And then you get to the final site audit. So it is important to do a final site audit. What we do is we actually test the site once it's launched, because quite frankly it takes a couple of weeks to test a site, and no site is ready and final 2 weeks before it launches. So we often give the client some kind of text that says, you know, we've thought about accessibility during the process. If you have a problem, let us know, and testing will be completed at this particular time. So, you know, fairly standard stuff like images with alt attributes, data tables, meaningful sequence, forms, complex images with long descriptions, videos, etc. And this is an example of an audit report, so you can sort of see the kind of stuff that you would want people to give you. So we've got a reference to the success criterion, the level, where it occurs. We also give impacts, so critical, high, medium and low, because there's a whole lot of stuff in WCAG 2 level A that there's no priority given to those things, and some things like table headers are really, really important, and other things like empty alt attributes on ornamental images, not that serious. So what the error is, an example, some code and a solution. So that's, you know, images missing alt attributes. It's pretty straightforward. This one, you know, uses colour to convey information. So you can see if you were red-blue colourblind, you'd have a pretty big problem reading that map. The flash viewer contains keyboard trap, so these are the kind of things that hopefully would be picked up in the template, but, you know, sometimes you have a template. We have developers give us, you know, a homepage and 2 or 3 subpages, and then they implement all these things at the final site stage. But then we have other clients that give us a homepage and 25 different template pages. So, you know, it's really depends how much you can catch in the template. You know, JavaScript issues. So, for example, that's what it looks like with JavaScript on, and you can move up and down. With JavaScript disabled, you actually can't move this thing. So really you just need a fallback, you know, so it just displays everything if JavaScript is disabled. When you're looking for someone to do an audit for you, you need to make sure that they do both manual and automated testing. Be careful of someone who will say they will just manually test your site, or someone who will say they'll just use automated testing tools. There's a whole bunch of things that require manual testing, but the problem with manual testing is you can only really test a few pages. There's a whole lot of stuff that can be found automatically, like images missing alt attributes and headings coded incorrectly and things like that. Yeah, make sure that people offer that service. What's not absolutely necessary, but something you might want to consider, is a list of where every error occurs. So especially if you've negotiated with your development firm to make all the fixes, then it's kind of useful to actually tell them where all the fixes are, and that way you can actually make sure all those fixes are done. And, you know, basically kudos to, you know, any accessibility firm that offers you user testing with people with disabilities. So this is an example error list from our automated testing tool, but there's lots of them out there. So you can see the kind of stuff that it gives you. So this, for example, is missing alt attributes, and it gives you the thumbnail and the fact that it's missing and where it sits, etc. And this is inaccurate summary attributes for tables. So you can see on this page, the summary text is table contains masthead for website, which is basically useless. This one here tells you where the missing headings are, so they're easy to implement. And this one tells you where the link text is inaccurate. Make sure you actually review the accessibility fixes. So it's not enough to just audit the site, get the developers to fix it. You need to make sure the developers fix things correctly. Once accessibility, and that's only then can you put a compliance claim on your website. The compliance claims are really complicated, text-heavy things. They're not very friendly. So I'd probably hide them on the bottom of your accessibility page or something like that and write something a bit nicer. Yeah, they are certainly valid. And make sure you do everything you can to avoid an accessibility complaint. So capture a complaint when it's made. Make sure you teach your help desk or your webmaster to recognise an accessibility complaint and escalate it immediately. Provide accurate contact details on your website. So don't have john.smith at blah, 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 because John Smith might leave. And make sure your content page is always accessible. Respond quickly. So respond to any accessibility complaint basically within 24 hours. Even if you're to say, we've got your complaint, we're not quite sure what we're going to do about it yet, but we're working on it, we have heard you. Respond appropriately, fix the problem quickly, and notify the complainant once the problem is fixed. So we often get pulled in by a client when they receive a complaint, and they often think the problem is much more serious than it is, and they're sometimes afraid to talk to the complainant because they're a little bit afraid of being told that they're inaccessible. But it is really important to have that dialogue to find out exactly what the problem is. And think about putting your goals in writing, especially if you have parts of your website that you know are not going to meet accessibility compliance requirements. So, heaps of PDFs that aren't tagged or videos without audio descriptions and things like that. Because you can put those kind of things in a disability action plan, and you can actually say, we've got a contingency plan if people need this accessibility stuff, but we're not going to provide it out of the box. And make sure you meet the AGMO reporting requirements. Even if you're not accessible, it's better to say, we're not accessible, we're working on it, than to not respond at all. And have a think about developing policy around problem areas, and this is, if they are applicable. So, PDFs without alternatives, videos without transcripts, captions or audio descriptions. Maybe you're tied into a particular video player that's not accessible. You need to make sure you have a policy around what you're going to do if someone complains. Maps. Google Maps out of the box is not accessible. So, you can either spend time getting your developers make that accessible, or, have some kind of process in place where you have a text version or something like that. Third-party content. We've all got third-party applications. They're mostly not accessible. Image galleries, interactive content, JavaScript, Java, Flash, etc. Learning modules. Learning modules are often very much inaccessible. So, make sure you have some kind of idea of what you're going to do if someone complains. And then you need to think about maintenance. We have a lot of clients that make their site fully accessible and then they think it's done and that's over and they don't need to think about accessibility anymore. That's not the case. So we've got one organisation that about 2 years ago we worked with the developers to make an accessible video player for them, which they didn't maintain, and it's now a keyboard trap. So maintenance, really important. Who's responsible for accessibility compliance? And that person needs to be as senior as possible. So we're starting to get CIOs to take responsibility for accessibility compliance. How often will sites be re-audited? And if it's more often than, once every 12 months, there's a problem. I got a phone call from a council last week saying, we're just going through your audit now. I just had a question about what's on page 93. And I was like, I did that audit in 2009 against WCAG 1. So it basically is completely irrelevant now. You need to think about these things. The WCAG 2 isn't likely to change, but your site definitely is. Who will pay for the re-audits? Can you get a budget line item for it? If it's done in-house, are there skilled staff? But remember, if you do the accessibility testing and stuff in-house, who's going to do those people's jobs while they're doing the testing? Because it doesn't take a day or two, it takes a long time. Will testing be conducted with people with disabilities? At Brisbane City Council, one of the things that I implemented in 2001 was a disability reference group. So when they went through Campbell Newman as mayor, who retrenched everybody, they had absolutely no funds for anything. Every time they released something or they fixed something, they got the disability reference group to test it, and it didn't cost them anything. And so that was a way they maintained their accessibility compliance during tight budget years. And they've got 14% of their staff have people with disabilities, which is really, really good. The APS is around 2 or 3% at the moment, so, a long way to go, unfortunately, here federally. And training. Now, it's not enough just to train your content authors when you're building a site, because people leave. And if you change your CMS, you need to train them all over again. So you need to start thinking about finding funds to train your content authors every 6 months, maybe every 12 months, because, you know, people move on. Now, what we did with Grains Research and Development Corporation, we actually came up with a webinar, so little 10-minute, I think there are 10 of them, 10-minute things on this is how you add a heading, this is the stuff about alt attributes, this is stuff about coding a table, and that way they basically mitigated the need to have ongoing training because it was part of their induction. If you're a content author, you're coming to work with us, you need to go through these webinars. Make accessibility an accepted part of the content publication process. A couple of CMSs, well, one CMS has a really good inbuilt accessibility testing feature, which basically tells you when you have an image that is missing an alt attribute. But there are other things that you can do. So AusArt, for example, which is our automated testing tool, has a one-page version, so you can just basically test one page at a time. And we've got some clients who have included that as their process before they publish a site. But you don't have to pay for something. WebAIM has a great product called Wave. Test one page at a time. So you just make it part of the process that before a page goes live, it gets tested by web. You know, you run it through WebAIM, run it through Wave, and see what the errors are. 6 monthly, maybe 12 monthly audits of content, regular training, and update policies as required. So we're seeing a lot of clients now move towards EPUBs. So they're kind of when they have an InDesign file, they create a PDF and they create an EPUB. So now they need policies about how they make sure that InDesign file is as accessible as possible, so the EPUB is as accessible as possible, and they're getting around the whole trying to provide an alternative to PDFs. So, more information. I mentioned the AusWiki fact sheets. We wrote them for the Bureau of Meteorology. They're free to use. There's a whole bunch of fact sheets, a whole bunch of areas. There's basically 4 sets of information. There's a section on the impact on users and the accessibility principles of a particular area. Then there's a manager checklist, which talks about how you would test a website in that particular category. Then there's a developer checklist, which talks about what the requirement is, incorrect code and correct code, so you can easily see, you know, what you should and shouldn't be doing. And the JavaScript fact sheets have these whole set of appendices which actually show you all these accessible JavaScript features, and they give you the code for it. And then we've got testing tool fact sheets. So we've got testing tool fact sheets for Wave, we've got testing tool fact sheets for the web development toolbar, and we've got testing tool fact sheets for our tool, AusArt. So I've also written a bunch of accessibility articles for SitePoint, the latest one on creating accessible online video, but a couple of months ago one on accessible links. Alt attributes and information relationships are a couple of years old, but they're still valid. I blog to my personal website and the Accessibility Oz blog, and WebAIM has some great articles. Just one thing to note with WebAIM is that they don't date their articles, so sometimes their articles are actually referring to WCAG 1 requirements instead of WCAG 2 requirements, so you sometimes need to be a little bit careful of that. And that's it. I hope I have helped and not terrified you. Do we have time for questions? No questions. Okay, I'm at Accessibility Oz, so tweet me questions or come talk to me. Thank you very much.